Welcome. Come on in and sit down. We want to get started because we have so many wonderful speakers who can tell us about Charles's work and his life and his impact on the region in which they live, that we don't want to cut into their time. And I'm not going to cut into their time. I'm going to be very, very brief. And many of you were here last night. And I just want to welcome you and thank you all again for coming from all over the country, and also to thank my co-organizers, William Boyd, Kristen Carpenter, Britt Banks, and especially Sean Labar, who makes all of this happen so smoothly for everybody. And other than that, I just am going to introduce my colleague, William Boyd, who is an expert in energy and environmental law and climate change law and policy. You can read more about his amazing accomplishments, especially for someone, still in the early stages of his career in the program and bio. And turn it over to William, and I'll look forward to, you'll be hearing from me more throughout the day. And we'll talk, of course, more and more about Charles throughout the day and all day long. So thank you so much, and here my colleague William Boyd, who will moderate the first panel.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah has a very creative understanding of co-organizer. I have to say that she has just been tremendous in organizing this whole thing. She's been the prime mover. I've tried to organize things with her before, and her single-mindedness and sort of devotion to every single detail kicks in, and so I just get out of the way. But this really is her vision. She's owned this from the beginning and has just been tremendous throughout. So I think we should give her a big round of applause. So good morning. I have the pleasure of moderating the first panel of the day on the Pacific Northwest. We have an all-star cast here, and I want to thank them especially for traveling so far to be with us here in Boulder for this special event. Their bios are in the materials. I'll briefly introduce them and then say a few words, and then turn it over to them. And they're going to give sort of 10 minutes of thoughts and reflections on Charles and his impact in the region. And then hopefully we'll have some time to engage in some discussion with all of you. Just going down the line here, Mike Anderson is a senior policy analyst at the Wilderness Society and also Charles's second cousin, so we're going to start with him. Bob, and second cousin is important, right? But very important. Far enough away to kind of watch it all, but also can be in the mix when things are good. Bob Anderson is a professor of law at the University of Washington and a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. Dolores Pigsley is the chairman of the Siletz tribe in Oregon. Fawn Sharp is the president of the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington. And John Volkman is the general counsel for the Energy Trust of Oregon. So I've had the great privilege of teaching the Advanced Natural Resources Field Seminar with Charles this semester. And it is genius. It really is. And we've heard a bunch about it. We'll hear more about it. But it is truly one of the most amazing experiments in pedagogy and teaching that I've ever witnessed and been a part of. And our focus this semester is on the Puget Sound and the Olympic Peninsula. We're headed out there next Thursday, and it's really a chance of a lifetime for me and for the students. And I'll say more about all of that later this afternoon when we bring all of this back to the University of Colorado in Boulder. But I just want to say a couple of things. In class this past Tuesday, Charles brought in a high-resolution 4-foot by 4-foot map of the region and started to walk us through the field seminar. He'd been sort of holding back all semester, and the students were getting anxious and edgy and trying to figure out where we're going to go. And finally, he brings in this map and literally walked us through the entire week and talked in detail about the many peoples and places that we'll be visiting, and reminding us, urging us, commanding us to develop a bird's eye view of the region as a whole, but to combine that with careful attention to the many different places that make up the region. And he stressed again and again how important it is for lawyers, young and old, working on natural resources and public lands issues to know every detail of the places they're working on and working on behalf of. And of course, Charles spent his early career as a law professor at Oregon, so in some ways it's quite appropriate that the Pacific Northwest is the first panel of the day. As he's done in so many other aspects of his work and life, he's developed strong and deep relationships with many people from the Northwest and has been intimately involved in the places they have made and continue to make out of the land. His relationship with Billy Frank is legendary, but there's so many others, including, of course, the people on this panel. And he's been right in the middle of so many important efforts to protect and restore so many important places in this region and others. I asked Jane Thompson, who's sitting right back there and who is our all-star librarian and just a phenomenal person, I asked her to take a look at Charles's corpus and what he had done on the Pacific Northwest. And so basically over more than 3 decades of writing about the region, its history and native peoples, the struggles over land, water, and fish, its tremendous natural and cultural diversity and its beauty, we sort of put together a list of what Charles has done, just as an academic. Of course, he's done so many other things. 2 major books, Frank's Landing and the Silet's book, and a third on the Bolt decision, which is underway. Significant attention to the region in at least 4 other books, several book chapters, and at least 20 major articles. Now, that's far more than a career's worth of writing for most academics, and this is just the first panel in the first region of the day. So it's really astonishing how much he has produced as a scholar, as an academic, as a public intellectual, as an advocate, and as a man. So I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Mike, and we'll hear from the panel.
Well, good morning. Yes, I am in a bit of a unique position because I am not only a colleague of Charles, but also a relative. And I can't claim to have been like a playmate of Charles when we were growing up, but I have sisters who were. So I did a little basic research interviewing my elder sister, cousin Ginny, for this talk, and she had some very interesting insights about Charles as he was. And Charles, did not like begin life in 1971, contrary to what we heard last night. He had a personality and a character of his own, and he was much beloved by his cousin Ginny and others. And some of the words the adjectives that she used to describe Charles were friendly, outgoing, an irrepressible smile, lots of fun, inquisitive, strong-willed, and naughty. And she said, Charles was really my favorite cousin because he would get in more trouble than I would. So anyway, Jenny wanted me to say that she's very proud of what Charles has done and what he's become. She also said, I would never have guessed the way he turned out. So anyway, just a little bit of background about Charles's family reputation. And so let me fast forward a bit to the 1970s, and Charles and I just happened to both land together. And by the way, I didn't really ever call Charles Wilkinson Charles. It was Cousin Charlie. And it's kind of shortened these days to just Cuz. So I refer to Professor Wilkinson as Cuz usually. But anyway, we happened to land together in Oregon in the late 1970s, and I became a student of his at the law school there, and we both shared a strong interest in the national forests. Oregon has fabulous national forests, but we were interested in the National Forest Policy planning, and especially the National Forest Management Act. So we did quite a bit of work on that together. And I have since graduating, worked for the Wilderness Society for 31 years on national forest planning and policy. And it was really great to have this symposium, have a chance to kind of read back over some of Charles's articles from the 1970s, early, the 80s, where he did a lot of thinking and writing about national forests. And, even though I am, a family member and probably have a little bias about Charles' role, I do think it's not going so far to say that Charles had a profound impact on the national forests, both in the Pacific Northwest and nationally. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about what I think are probably the three most important Forest Service national forest conservation actions that have taken place in the last quarter century, and in which I strongly believe that Charles played a very important role and for various reasons. Let me just, and those three actions are the Northwest Forest Plan, the Roadless Area Conservation Rule, and the National Forest Management Act Planning Rule of 2000 and 2012. So let me just lay out my argument for you about this and see, hopefully it makes sense, because I really do feel that that is Charles's legacy for the national forest. First, regarding the Northwest Forest Plan, when we came into Oregon in the 1970s, the Forest Service was really in the heyday of its timber, its timber era. And, one thing that Charles did, he brought historical perspective about natural resources management from a variety of, perspectives, agencies, et cetera. And when he looked at the Forest Service, he said, this is an agency that currently is dominated by timber production. Even though it's supposed to be multiple use, it really is not. And, a lot of people were saying the same thing, but what Charles did was he said, not only is this, inappropriate, but it's really not consistent with the National Forest Management Act. This was not what Congress wanted the Forest Service to be doing, and it was time to change, and change in a big way. So in the Northwest, of course, with the old growth liquidation that was going on, a third of all the Forest Service's timber was coming off those few national forests. That was where the rubber really hit the road, and it was in the courtroom where the changes had to take place. And Charles's work on National Forest Management Act and his policy work about timber domination really resonated with the judges, Judge Dwyer in particular, Ninth Circuit, and really played a really important role, I think. Okay, secondly, the Roadless Area Conservation Rule. Okay, this was the policy that protected 58.5 million acres of inventoried roadless areas in the national forests. This was done at the end of the Clinton administration. And Charles's role in that was, because as a legal scholar, he not only looked at the law as telling the agencies what they could not do, but also what authorities they had. He looked at the history of the Forest Service. He looked at Gifford Pinchot and his grazing regulations in 1906, upheld by the Supreme Court in the Grimaud case. He looked at the Forest Service's hard rock surface mining regulations that Chief McGuire had adopted. And he encouraged the Forest Service to take advantage of their very broad authority under the Forest Service Organic Act. And then along came, at the later part of the Clinton administration, a new Forest Service chief, Mike Dombeck, who really wanted to change things. He wanted to help the fish. He wanted to help the water quality. He looked at the Forest Service road building program and the impact on roadless areas. And he said, I would like to make an important policy statement here. And it was through Charles's his work on authority of the Forest Service that helped the Forest Service realize that it could do something like the roadless area conservation rule, and the courts have upheld that authority, most notably in the 10th Circuit just a couple of years ago. And again, I think it was Charles's his legal analysis that taught the Forest Service, the advocates like the Wilderness Society, that the Forest Service could do these things. And then finally, the Forest Planning Rule. Charles was a member of the Committee of Scientists late in the Clinton administration that helped develop the planning rule. But Charles's unique role here was he brought his vision, I don't know whether you call it the Wilkinson Doctrine, but it's his unique melding, I think, of the ideas of trust from Indian law. He had the idea of the public trust doctrine and taking the long view, looking out generations as his Native American colleagues always do, and he encouraged us to do that. And he kind of brought a lot of those concepts together in the planning rule in the idea of sustainability. He didn't coin the term sustainability, but when it came into the Forest Service planning rule, that was the overriding concept. And then he brought in all these ideas about non-commodity values and taking the long view of national forest resource policy. So in closing, I just want to say thank you, Charles, for your vision, your inspiration. You've served the forest well, and congratulations also for turning out better than your cousin Ginny ever thought you would. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. See you, organizers, Charles, friends, and others. Well, it's really an honor to be here, and I was really struggling to think of, what could I contribute to something like this when there are so many brilliant people who are going to heap praise on Charles and so on. And I was thinking about it as I was looking at Boulder Creek, and I thought of when I first met Charles when I was in law school back in, I think, 1981, when he was visiting at Minnesota, and I couldn't take his class because I was a 1L, but I got the best thing out of him. I got a beer, and I got a recommendation to work at NARF. And it's never been the same since. So I came out here and stayed in Boulder. And I remember when I was here, just fresh out of law school, riding up Boulder Canyon with my friend Rick Dufresne, NARF lawyer. And we saw Charles standing on Boulder Creek, looking up in the sky on a Sunday morning at about 8 o'clock. And I said, "What the hell is he doing?" And Rick said, "He's thinking about the West." And sure enough, he was. And we're all better for it. But what I want to talk about is the Northwest, the really Northwest, the Alaska office that NARF opened in 1984. I was a fresh young lawyer at NARF, and there was all this activity. And so David and Charles were down at NARF all the time this summer, and they were meeting with Anita Remorowski and others to talk about Alaska. And I didn't really pay much attention to what was going on. And, John was sort of very fiscally conservative and, was against, opening this office in a rash sort of way. But eventually, Charles and the board and David and Anita and the staff and Ada, who was on our board at the time, convinced John to allow us to open an office in Alaska. But only if we got a grant from the Rural CAP program up there for $9,000. And so John said, well, all right, we're going to send a young guy up there, which was me. I was 27, and an experienced lawyer, which was Larry Aschenbrenner, and many of you know Lair. And so John said, you can go ahead. Charles will be there to guide you, and David. They've got a lot of experience and knowledge. But John said, go ahead and move out, start driving to Seattle to get on the ferry, but call me every day at the end of the day and find out if I want you to turn back or not. And so so this is where the persistence comes in, you know, when I get to Billings, hi John, I'm in Billings, keep going, you know, I'm in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, keep going. Should I get on the ferry in Seattle? Yeah, but call me when you get to Haines. So I call when I get to keep going, you know, and we get up there and we had office space at Alaska Legal Services and we're housed there. And we stayed for about 6 or 7 months in that office. And John says, don't commit to anything. And I said, well, what about office space? Stay there as long as you can. And then Charles came up to visit us and buck us up. And eventually we kept that office. And, you know, it's been, 32 years now that office has been open up in Alaska, doing tremendous work. They got 4 lawyers up there. And it's really due to Charles and David and Ada that office got off the ground. And it's a fantastic experience for me. And you know, Charles taught persistence in opening that office, creativity. I had worked with Bob Pelsiger on the San Luis Rey water case in the year that I was in Boulder when I got out, and so I learned a little bit about water law. And then we got this Katie John litigation going up there, and all of a sudden water law became important through various iterations of that case. And I was able to get help from Charles and David and everybody else at NARF to, you know, prevail in that case. But again, persistence, because the case is still going. You know, and now the issue was before the Supreme Court in this crazy sturgeon case involving a hovercraft within a national park. But again, it's persistence and wisdom that Charles has planted, you know, personally with me, but with everybody who's part of NARF and so many others around the country. It's just amazing what he has done in his career. And just the resilience to be able to, you know, have a setback and then start anew with a new idea is just something that I learned and is just incredibly valuable to me. And the work that Charles has done in the writing is just nothing short of fantastic. Now, he supported us in Alaska, and you know, one thing that amazed me was how unflappable he was. And I wasn't going to tell this story, but I think I'm going to anyway. So Charles comes up there the first year, and we're up in Fairbanks. It's 40 below zero, and we're meeting Will Mayo and some other tribal leaders for lunch. And Lair Aschenbrenner and I and Charles, and we're sitting around this table in at some hotel restaurant, and all of a sudden, people are starting to walk around wearing lingerie. And I'm looking, I was 27, I'm like, what is happening? And Charles is giving a speech and he doesn't miss a beat, and I'm like, but Fairbanks, 40 below zero. I mean, what? Unbelievable and unflappable. It was awesome. I couldn't believe it. And you know, there's more where that came from, but I'm going to save those for tonight. And you know, Charles has left a big mark in the Northwest, and you know, my predecessor at the University of Washington was Ralph Johnson, and you know, I came into a lot of Ralph's papers, including papers from the 82 Cohen Handbook, and so I never took Indian law or water law, so I have that 82 handbook, and I just studied it religiously, and I looked in Ralph's papers, and Charles was the managing editor of the handbook. And I found this memorandum to the Cohen board from Charles. And it shows what a great writer he is. To talk about a guy who can get to the point. And the title is Boxes of Paper. And it says, to the Cohen board, we have had several discussions regarding the Cohen papers. Actually, the papers are just boxes of paper consisting mainly of these things: random drafts with strange markings in them, correspondence with an unpleasant publisher, memoranda from Renard and me insisting that everyone hew rigorously to deadlines that we know there was no chance anyone would meet, mouse turds and mice nests, memos from Chambers and Pelsiger insisting that we make certain passages stronger or else they will lose every case in court. And so it goes on. He says, I have rotated the boxes, which weigh between 1/4 and 1/2 of a ton, among various storage rooms in this law school. I am now moving to Colorado. I don't want to move the boxes. I don't want to mail the boxes to any library. I want to throw the boxes away. I am going to throw the boxes away. Unless I receive by mail and within 5 days written responses from 3/4 of the board insisting that we not throw the boxes away. Professor Ralph Johnson's vote does not count. My affection rides with all of you, even with our tribal elder, Ralph. So, what a fun guy to know and to be around. And, he's awesome, and that's good enough for me. Thanks, Charles.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. And it's been a long haul. I first met Charles Wilkinson in September 1975, and I had just got elected to the tribal council. And our tribe was a terminated tribe, so we looked at the Menominee tribal restoration, and I was so happy to see Ada Deer here. And Charles had worked on that. And so my brother, Joe Lane, happened to be chairman at the time and contacted Charles and began a process of getting the Siletz tribe restored. And he was behind every movement that we made. And it was a daunting task for our tribe. We had no money. We had only a cemetery that we owned. And Charles would come out and we'd have meetings after everybody had a job. So after we got off work, and when I first got elected in September, I had just started a new job because we just moved back we were at Haskell in Kansas for a little while. And our first meeting was from 6 until 2 in the morning. And that was how restoration meetings happened because everybody worked. We had no tribal funds. And so we worked very hard to get the Siletz tribe restored, and we were the second tribe in the nation following the Menominees, and so all of the other Oregon tribes that have been restored have followed in the footsteps and have restoration acts similar to the Menominee and the Siletz. But Charles was working for NARF, and the first time I met him, he was a little scary because he was so in charge. And when we were in Washington, D.C., the whole council went when we had a restoration hearing. We met every day. We ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and we talked strategy. And sometimes we'd get silly, and sometimes Charles would be really angry with us and slam his fist on the desk and say a few bad words and get us back on track. And told us we needed to be professional, we needed to be nice. And of course, none of us had been through this process. So we all set out, we all had appointments with different congressmen and senators, and the most difficult one was, of course, was the congressman from Oregon, and his name was Jim Weaver. And I don't know if any of you remember Jim Weaver, but Charles was telling us that, he's going to be tough, and we need to go in there and we need to tell our story and we need to be accurate. And so we get in there and sit down, and Jim Weaver starts spouting what Chief Joseph said, and we're sitting there, and all of a sudden Charles jumps up and he slams books on the table and starts yelling and cussing at Jim Weaver. And we about fell off our chair because it was like, holy cow, it's going to throw us all out. Anyway, Charles made his point, and I think Jim Weaver apologized at that particular point for his comments that he thought would apply to us, that Chief Joseph wouldn't want us to be separated and be federally recognized. He wanted us to live in harmony with everybody else in the world. So that was quite a task, and the tribe did get restored. And after restoration, we had talked about a book documenting our history, and we thought it would be a rather simple process and a simple book. And of course, Charles' name came up as somebody who might be able to help us. And we knew he was working here full-time, and we didn't know what the prospects were, but I met Charles in Portland and mentioned it to him, and he was all excited, and he said, yeah, I'm going to be off for a year, and I can do this, and this will be a year-long project. And we started the project, and I don't know how many years it was really, but it was a couple of years, And the researchers from here came out to assist with the book, and it was very in-depth, and I hope some of you, I read The People Are Dancing. And Charles came out, and every time he came out, he would walk up through our tribal cemetery, and he'd visit the grave sites of most of the people that served on the council at that time are all gone. I don't know why I'm still around, but I am. And he would have his time with those people that he knew from restoration. But the vision of the history of the book was, we thought it was pretty simple, but when we started with the ancient times and got into where we came from and how we were moved, it was proved to be really a daunting task. And Charles stuck with us the whole rest of the way. And along with restoration, and I think Charles mentioned it last night, there's been a cultural reawakening of the tribe. And you don't get any revenue or anything from the cultural revitalization. It's an individual thing. And we've since built a dance house, and we have our Nadash ceremonies at the dance house, and we have ceremonies called Run to the Rogue. And Charles has participated in those ceremonies. He's come down and run with the runners, and we go to where the original treaty was signed, and he's really become a part of the Siletz family. And we appreciate Ann sharing Charles and the family. And we all know, those of us who are elected, that once you get elected, you end up spending a lot of time missing a lot of activities. You miss birthdays and anniversaries, and you have to reschedule everything. But Charles has proven to be part of our big family, and has helped us celebrate restoration and Nadash and Run to the Rogue. And we really appreciate all of the work on the book, and the time and attention that he's given to the Siletz tribe. And I don't think he was ever paid a cent for it. All he gets is a lot of appreciation and love. And we have a gift for you, Charles. And this was made by one of your favorite people. I'll bring it up. But and in coming up here, I was thinking of a lot of stories one could tell. A lot of them are probably not tellable, of things that happened, and the funny things that happened, the serious things that happened. But it was really pleasurable to work with Charles, and we appreciate him very much. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Fawn Sharp. I'm president of the Quinault Nation. I'm very honored to be here. I wouldn't miss it. Yesterday, about 11 o'clock in the morning, I came this close to canceling. I was at the airport, and I was receiving a series of emails from our staff at Quinault. We had an extreme weather event, and it was storming. The ocean had encroached into our village and came up close to the courthouse. And I received emails. They were getting ready to evacuate some of our elders. And I could see the headline now, ocean breaches at 11:20, tribal president leaves SeaTac at 11:25. And that would be the story. That would be the political story, obviously. But I thought nothing was going to keep me from here. Shortly after 11, when I came that close, I'd received an email that by noon the storm was going to subside, and I had the all clear to come here. So I'm just incredibly honored and grateful that I have the opportunity to spend this time with so many people to honor an incredible person. Charles has had, to say he has had a profound impact on the Northwest tribes and our treaty fisheries is an understatement. Since receiving this invitation, I've really tried to figure out how could I best characterize and summarize the work that Charles has put into defending our treaty and our ocean fisheries through the Bolt decision. And the one thing that kept coming back to me as a way of characterizing Charles, first of all, he's a gift to Indian people. But secondly, I see him as a storyteller and an author. And to really explain what that means to me, I want to take you back to basic writing, elementary school. We're told that when we're asked to tell a story, it's important to know the audience, to know who, what, where, when, and why when you write. Charles knew who. He knew us as Indian people. He took the time to truly understand us. And there have been many times when I've been in tribal meetings and I've been witness to Charles' speech and his actions and his incredible love and affection for Indian people. And there have been times where I've been envious of that. As a tribal leader, I feel I carry a tremendous love in my heart for my people. You know, it gives sacrifice, time, energy, and effort. But to see the love and affection of a man who has dedicated his heart, his mind, his spirit to advocate our interests is enviable. And I love Charles dearly for that, to share that type of love for our people. So that's the who. The what? Now, as lawyers, we know the what. That's the issue, right? You spot the issues, you work the issues, you advocate the issues. And for a lot of legal advocates, that's where it begins and that's where it ends. You get a case, you analyze it, you argue it, you go on to the next case, you analyze it, you argue it. But Charles dedicated just his incredible gift and legal intellect to understand, thoroughly understand and analyze the legal issues and commit every bit of his intellect to understanding the ins and outs of not only our case, but the opponents and the opposition, and anticipating where those arguments may come from. And we saw it time and time again in his advocacy. The where, who, what, where, understanding place, understanding our geography, understanding the natural environment, the world that we're gifted by the Creator, and how sacred that is. Not only for us today, but understanding what sacred elements that meant to our ancestors, and how sacred those same natural environment and that world, what that would mean to future generations yet to be born. Charles understood the place, the where, every bit of the natural environment and the beauty that the Creator has gifted all of us to be stewards, to fight for it, to defend it, to protect it, to revere it. That's Charles. Who, what, where, when. Charles could tell you the when. He could tell you the when in 1950. He could tell you the when in 2009. He could tell you the when in 1855. All up and down that time, that span of generations of what things meant to us as Indian people. Who, what, where, when, why. Why it's so important for us to champion and advocate those sacred teachings, those things that mean so much to us. Why do we do this? And what does it mean? Charles had, and I truly believe it's a gift from our Creator. He was called to a certain place. He was born in the East, and something was placed in his heart to come west. And from my perspective, when you have an individual that has such a deep appreciation and understanding of the people, of the place, and the time, you recognize as an individual how limited you are because you understand the grandeur. You understand the sacred nature of the work that we do. And you realize how relatively insignificant we are as individuals And I think that's where we see an incredible amount of humility in Charles. He's larger than life. We hear it. He's larger in life in that the humility he has as one individual, recognizing the interrelationship that we have to the natural world, to each other, to our brothers, to the relationships he's had with men like Billy Frank, the camaraderie. We are insignificant as individuals, but collectively and together we are larger than life when we reflect the values and the teachings of our ancestors, the visions and dreams of the children yet to be born, and the gifts that the Creator has given each one of us. And we put that to work to advance and protect our people. That's Charles. I'm so grateful and honored to have known Charles, to have worked with him. This month, it'll be 10 years I've served as tribal president. In May, it'll be 20 years of service to the Quinault Nation, 10 as an attorney and 10 as a tribal leader. So in that 20 years, I've seen the first 10 as a lawyer in law, the last 10 as a policy person, as a tribal leader. And I can honestly say that through that 10 years, I've had an opportunity to work closely with Charles on some pretty amazing issues, to learn from him, to love him, to be inspired by him. And I can't express enough what that means to not only us at Quinault, but all the tribes in the Northwest. Billy Frank often said, we have to tell our story, tell our story, tell our story. And I'm so grateful that we had a storyteller and an author who truly understood us, our time, our place, our why, our struggle. I've often said that we fight because we're embattled. We struggle because there's a cause. But if it was our choice, we would live at peace with all of humanity and all things living. That is our value system, and that's our goal. And with Charles, we've been able to bring those values into the modern era, capture those in law, in cases, in policy, for future generations to benefit. And I know Charles' work is going to go long beyond our lifetime, long beyond this generation. Those sacred lands, the teachings, the fishing on the ocean, there'll be Quinaults 100 years from now fishing on that ocean. And it's all to the work of people like Charles. Charles, I love you. I'm so grateful and honored. You're a friend, you're a family, you're part of our spirit. Thank you for committing your heart, your mind, your spirit to knowing us, to loving us, and to protecting our interests from now until the end of time. Thank you.
Well, like a lot of you in the audience, it dawned on me at a certain point that Charles had become a national treasure. And I can't tell you exactly when that happened, but I do think it began when he moved to Oregon. You may not have been in law school in the early 1970s, although some of you perhaps, you know who you are. It was natural resources law then. The law of extraction, taking water out of rivers and pumping oil out of the ground. And it was, to someone like me and I think to someone like Charles, sort of a dismal area of law at that point. When Charles started teaching at Oregon, he started from a different point. In his mind, the water law was the public lands law was about grazing and timber harvest and those things, but it was also about fish and game and the other species that live in forests, and it's about conserving those things for the future. You can see this in one of his earliest articles, his early scholarly article, The Law of the Pacific Salmon Fishery, which, salmon policy is not a big deal here in Boulder, but in the Northwest it really is. To many tribes It's fundamental to, there's a commercial salmon fishing industry. There are a lot of sports fishers. Salmon is a big deal. There's a lot of emotion, a lot of fighting over salmon. When Charles got to Oregon, most of the law of salmon had to do with harvest, and it had kind of the same extractive focus that the rest of natural resources law had at that time. It was dividing up the catch. It had a wrinkle in that Indian treaty fishing rights were at stake, and they were central to what was going on in the Northwest. So that made it quite a different area of law. And even better, around the time Charles arrived in Oregon, the tribes had begun to blur the line between fish harvest and fish habitat, water and rivers, because you don't have healthy fish runs if you don't have healthy rivers. So when Charles wrote about the subject in his article, he didn't pick a side in the salmon wars. That was not the starting point. He started with a salmon as it was born in a wilderness stream in Idaho, and he followed it all the way down the river, out into the ocean, back up out of the ocean into the rivers, back up to its spawning ground where it had been born. And at every point along the way, he looked at the human institutions that affected this fish and how they worked and how they interacted with grazing and timber harvest and cities and other things. So the article didn't shout about any of this, but you couldn't avoid seeing by the end of the article how fragmented all of these institutions were, how they didn't fit together, and how in many ways they had very little connection to this salmon who was swimming through them. It was a vividly written article. It was incredibly scholarly. You've read his articles. For people who worked in the field like me, it was not just an argument about how salmon policy should be framed and integrated. It was an encyclopedia. The pages were 4 lines of text and 67 lines of footnotes, fine print footnotes. You know how they look. That's not unusual in the legal literature, but in Charles's article, the fine print was this incredible richness of detail. I was involved in salmon policy for a number of years, and my copy of that article is just worn to a frazzle because I kept going back to those footnotes, and next to the footnotes you see lots of scrawls in my handwriting as I worked through various issues over the years. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that article cited and quoted in reports, in other books, in legal decisions. It had such influence because of the depth and vividness of the writing and the scholarship. My family used to have a bunch of cabins, summer cabins, on this high ridge in Wyoming, and Charles spent a few weeks there working on crossing the next meridian. I think you started, this may have been when you were in Oregon, I'm not sure. Maybe you came back to Boulder by then. But I'd been going to the cabins for a number of years, and I had a clear sense of where they were. High ridge, looking out over the Hoback River Basin, 50 miles from Jackson Hole, roughly, 28 miles to Pinedale, the home of the roadkill burger, 18 miles to the Green River Bar, where if you stop and you buy a bottle, they give you a go cup of bourbon to shorten the rest of your drive. So This was obviously the place that had all the amenities you need if you're working on a book. It appealed to Charles. And when he got back from the cabins, he told me it had been a great place to work on his book. He really got a lot out of it, and how amazed he was that here the cabins were smack on this ridge that divides the Columbia River Basin from the Colorado River Basin. And he's saying this, and I'm thinking, why did I never know that? Charles carries this map around in his head that he's constantly updating, and he's connecting where he is to continental geography and Western hydrology. It's just the way his mind works. That's how he sees things. He also obviously sees things in relation to tribes. Dee talked about the Siletz restoration. I won't add much to that, but you know, it sometimes strikes me that the Siletz tribe now it's the Lincoln County's, I don't know if it's the largest employer, but one of the largest employers. It's got all these social programs. It's got buildings with administrative offices. It's got this incredible dance hall and dancing and cultural life. It's this remarkable community of people. And I think to people who weren't working on restoration at the time, you look back and it just looks inevitable. All of that talent and life was going to find a way to resurge, notwithstanding termination. But I think Dee, and I think the people who were on the tribal council at the time in the 1970s would say that there was nothing inevitable about it. It was hard work. It took creativity and vision, and there's just no question it took Charles. Charles was the organizing force in that process. Many of you know the Cohen book, and the sacred text in Indian law really gave rise to the area of law, in my view, the modern Indian law. And when the Board of Editors was organized to restore it back to its original spirit after that awful revision of the 1950s, and Charles became managing editor. I was never sure exactly how that happened. I think it happens the way a lot of Charles's projects do. He just rises to the occasion, and he became the managing editor. It was a huge job. It was really complicated. Every chapter had its own author, and yet everything had to be integrated into a book that had a voice that fit together and that made sense. And it was obvious after a year or so working on it that this was going to be a heavy lift. So Charles, over the course of, 2 or 3 years, organized a bunch of students at the University of Oregon Law School, and he picked people with all this talent, people like Ann Amundsen and Vern Peterson and Craig Dorsey and others, people who have become important figures in natural resources law since then. And they did all of this synthesizing and checking and editing. I know that it was hard work, but I bet if you ask them what it was like, they would say that it was the most interesting thing they did in law school. The thing that most influenced their professional lives, and I bet they would say that Charles became for them not just a mentor, but a friend, or in Ann's case, more than that. And this leads me to my last observation about Charles. All of us who've worked with him have become part of a bigger, more vivid enterprise because of him. He sees the law as part of a complicated, intricate, pulsing world. He probes it and he explores it and he brings us into it with that generous spirit of his and his vision and his sense of justice. So as Ann Getches was saying, Charles is he's a fire who warms us, and I'm very grateful to you.
Wow, thank you all so much. That was amazing. We do have a few minutes, and I would love to open this up and have some discussion or hear some thoughts or maybe some untellable stories or anything you want to talk about. I know there are many people in the audience here who have worked with Charles for a long time and have focused on the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, so please. Zach. Can you tell us what Charles told Jim Weaver? Is that was?
You want to hear the word? He said, "God damn it, Jim, that's not true," and he went on a lot of other words. And we were just surprised, to say the least.
I was there too,
Yeah.
and the way I remember it was Charles said, "Jim, I know who you are, and that is not you. You are," and he proceeded to describe who Jim ought to be. And
That was our nice, we were supposed to be nice that day.
Others. Is that JJ?
Yeah. Well, I used to say last night when they opened up to questions for former students. Hey, Charles. Good to see you. So I guess what I want to say, and I think that it's really been expressed all through this panel, is that we're talking a lot about policies and things we've done. But from a student's perspective, I'd like to also thank you for who you are. And some of the qualities that I think a lot of us who've had the pleasure of working with you value is your listening, your deep listening, and your standards, and your inspiration for all of us. And I think those are qualities in a professor that are really hard to find because they're used to talking and teaching. And I really felt like you always learned with us. And that's something really special. And so I want to thank you for that on behalf of everybody. And also share a story. I have an overshare problem. Like, I would go to Charles all the time and say, oh, I don't think I want to do this or that because of whatever reasons that were going through my mind. And I think one of the moments that I decided that practicing Indian law would be a good fit was when I said, I think I just need to do something a little more revolutionary, a little bit more dynamic. And I don't know if being a lawyer is really that thing. And he just looks at me like, are you crazy? Do you mean like blowing up dams? And, that was a moment where I realized, yeah, that is revolutionary and that is dynamic and that is completely new and something that wasn't ever thought possible. And I think that that's applicable to the Northwest panel because you've helped a lot of people and a lot of rivers up there and a lot of students. So thanks, Charles, and congratulations.
So JJ is inspiring me to tell more stories. My name's Amy Cordalis. I'm a member of the Yurok tribe. I'm also an attorney for the Yurok tribe. I started my career with NARF, and I didn't have the good fortune of being able to be one of Charles's students. But as soon as I learned about Charles and spent 5 minutes with him, I realized he was the kind of person who could, to your very core, inform the kind of lawyer that you want to be, and that I wanted to be. And so I have been trying to follow around him and be on his foottails ever since. But what I wanted to talk about today is Charles wrote Yurok's Constitution. We formed our model tribal government in 1988 and didn't get around to our governing documents and forming those until the early 90s. And my aunt Sue Maston was a part of our transition council, and she knew Charles, and she recruited him as quickly as she could to be a part of the drafting process of our tribal constitution. I am so thankful for Charles's contributions to that Constitution, because as a tribal attorney, every day almost, I'm going back to our tribal Constitution and using the words, using the very delicately chosen words to inform our practice and our representation of my tribal nation. And the approach that Charles had, and we heard about this yesterday, his empathy, his understanding of tribal people is reflected in our Constitution. And now as a tribal attorney, I'm able to use that every single day in my practice and our interactions with the federal government, with other tribes, with the states. And it's been so incredibly helpful. And so I'm so glad that you were able to influence the very formation of our modern tribal government. So I thank you for that. The other thing that I wanted to share is that when Charles took one of his classes back to the Klamath Basin, I was able to work with him on the portion of the trip in Yurok country, the lower part of the Klamath River. And I got to spend the day on a jet boat with him and his students going up the Klamath River. And we got to go to Blue Creek. And Blue Creek is the very start, the very foundation of Yurok's high country, which you probably all know. The high country was involved in, the Ling case and so on and so forth. So it's that place has so much meaning. And to stand at the mouth of Blue Creek with Charles Wilkinson and give him a big hug was one of the most wonderful moments of my professional career. To just sort of be in a place that I understood and he understood has so much meaning to us, and to be there in a place with someone who has fought so hard for the rights of Native people, and to be able to hug him in that place and sort of have all of the ancestors be there to acknowledge, and what I felt was the ancestors acknowledging the contributions he's made was so meaningful. So thank you for that time. Thank you for your contributions. Your work is sort of like water, right? It just trickles through all of us. It's strong enough to move rocks and mountains and everything else, and and it will always be here with us. So thank you.
Seth.
Hi, I'm Seth Wilkinson, and since I live out in the Northwest, I thought this might be a good moment to share a story that came out of my first year of law practice. I'd been out of law school just for a few months. I'd probably just started work, and I had done something really stupid, and I can't remember what it was, but I had made some classic first-year associate mistake, and I was so cut up about it, I just didn't know what to do. I thought, am I even cut out for this job? And so what I did was I called up my dad, and I told him about it. And he said, to be an excellent lawyer, you have to always be acutely sensitive to your own performance. And he said, that's exactly what you're doing right now. And that's why you're going to be an excellent lawyer. And he turned that whole moment of angst into kind of a moment of strength. And it's something that I've always carried with me, and whenever I have one of those moments again, it allows me to remember that this is part of the process of being a great lawyer. So thank you for that, Dad.
We have so much more to talk about. We're going to, I think, end it there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Seth, for those final comments. And please join me in thanking our incredible panel here. Turn it back over to Sarah Krakoff.
We're pushing you kind of hard today. There isn't a break right now. There's a break after the next panel. And I just want to remind you that this is a symposium in honor of Charles. So we are pushing you hard. and we're going to make you work by staying in your seats and listening because we had just so many people. And frankly, there are a number of you in the audience that could also have joined us up on any of these panels. So we were really pressed to have everyone speak who could speak about Charles. And right now, we're going to have one of the first of a series of short readings by friends, fans, former students in some cases former state Supreme Court justices. Okay, only one of those. But do short readings that reflect Charles's work or that are drawn from Charles's work. And Julia Guarino is going to do the first of those. Oh, there you are. Oh, good. I'm like, wherever she is, and then, like everything with Charles, magically, she was conjured right here. So Julia is a graduate of our law school, and she is now a graduate student in the geography department. And Julia has published several articles, one of which grew out of one of Charles's classes. And she is just an amazing young person who is starting to make her way in this terrain that Charles has laid out for so many of us. So thank you, Julia.
So again, my name is Julia Guarino, and I'm a graduate of the law school in 2013, and also have the pleasure of being a research faculty member here now. And I also was able to serve as Charles's research assistant along with Travis Bruner, I think is in the audience as well, my 3L year, which was just amazing. And incidentally, I also went to high school a town over from where Charles went to high school in Connecticut, and that was also not my fault. I'm here now. I also want to express my odd being able to be in this room with all of you, and to Charles, my deepest gratitude for your mentorship and support that's never ending, and your inspiration and your wisdom. And Charles, you constantly remind us of how important this work is in public lands and Indian law, and I'm so grateful to be a part of the community and to start my career here. So in that spirit, I will do just a short reading from Messages from Frank's Landing. I asked Billy a question that I'd want to ask him for a long time. Billy, are you hopeful? In the long run, can we save the wild salmon? He paused for a good minute. Then, 65 years old, his tied-back hair streaked with gray, he leaned forward and answered, talking as he always does with his young-looking hands and his spirit as much as his voice. Here's what I tell Indian people when I talk to them. I tell them I wish we had co-management then. We might have been able to use the treaties and our professionals back when we really needed it. But we do have that decision, and it gives us a chance. We're the advocates for the salmon, the animals, the birds, the water. We're the advocates for the food chain. We're an advocate for all of society. Tell them about our life. Put out the story of our lives and how we live with the land and how they're our neighbors, and how you have to respect your neighbors and work with your neighbors. So what you do is you do what you can in your lifetime. Then that'll go on to another lifetime, then another lifetime, then another. Some of the scientists say that our rivers spring Chinook went extinct back in the 40s. I don't believe that. I can't believe that any salmon is extinct. The salmon was here when we got here. Nature put the salmon here for us, and nature will take care of that salmon. That life is still here in the streams, out in the ocean. I can't believe that all that life from the Nisqually headwaters all the way up to Alaska is gone. I'll never say extinct. With a flicker of the right action, that life will revive itself. Billy sat for a moment, then he got up to leave and we gave each other bear hugs. Tired but too wound up to go to bed in spite of an early plane I needed to catch, I stayed up for a while, walking around the room in my rumpled clothes and my socks. I realized how invested I've become in the question I'd asked him about hope. Young people ask me the same question with some frequency and urgency. Look at what he's done, I kept saying to myself as I paced the room. Look at all he's done, and he's been right before. Billy, I found myself shouting it out loud, although he'd been back in his room by now. Billy, God damn it. I hope you live to 104. And Charles, we hope you live to 140.
Thank you, Julia. And now I get to moderate the Colorado Plateau panel. And as you know, this day is organized by place. And I think I'll just mention that this may be the only thing in my entire career that I was able to improve on something by Charles. And it was this, that when Charles and I first started talking about the structure, Charles and Kristen and William and I, the structure for this event, he had it divided by sort of topic, you could say. And I was not that satisfied with that. I think, like many of us who work in this area, I think the reason we got into the fields we did was because, to put it simply, we care about everything, not just one thing at a time, trees and water and so forth. And I think in particular, if you think and hear about Charles's work as you are doing throughout the day, you know that especially the role of Native peoples, American Indian tribes, is just inseparable from place. And in so much of the work we do elsewhere, it's all separated out. Water, land, energy, and Native peoples, as if these are separable concepts, ideas, things. So we decided that we would have this whole day structured instead by place. And already, obviously, it makes so much sense. And so I am moderating this panel, the Colorado Plateau. It's a region that many of you know well. It starts on the western slope of the Rockies and is this sort of geologically, right, this uplift that is a big chunk really of southeastern Utah, some of the most beautiful, wild, bizarre places in the world, not just the country, and includes all of northern Arizona, including the Grand Canyon, and then a big chunk of northwestern New Mexico, and just about, that little southwest corner of our state, Colorado. And as William described this morning, when you work and teach in this area, and in particular, when you work and teach in the shadow of Charles, you do just think about your work in the context of place. It's just this sort of physical thing that happens, right? I can picture that whole map of the Colorado Plateau. I've now taught the field trip, I think 3 times, and I always go back to the plateau. It's a place I lived before I ever met Charles, actually, and many of our work stories and work lives have overlapped since then. I want to mention a couple of people who couldn't make it, but you've met them if you've read Charles's work. One of them is Eric Swenson, who is an attorney who started with DNA People's Legal Services and worked with Charles decades ago on those school cases, the equal protection cases on behalf of Navajo school children. And if you read that chapter in Fire on the Plateau involving Eric, there's some of the cursing and swearing that you've heard about, but I can tell you not nearly as much as I'm sure happened in real life between those two people. And so I say hello and a salute to you from Eric Swenson, who unfortunately couldn't join us here today. So I don't want to take time away from this amazing panel of people who are here with us to talk about Charles and his work on the Colorado Plateau. We are ordering them slightly differently than you see in the program. because I asked Jim Enote if he would speak first, and then we'll follow in alphabetical order from there. So we'll hear from Jim, and then Natasha, and then Daniel, and then Eric. And you have all of their bios about their work in your program, so I won't belabor the point, except just to say that there is just incredible work going on right this second. That's part of Charles's ongoing legacy, and every time I get a little snippet of it, it makes me just want to jump in my car and drive down there myself and start helping out with the Bears Ears, and or go to Jim's farm, or continue to do the ongoing lifelong work that Charles and so many others have done in this area to make the plateau a place that so many people care about and want to continue to turn into a living, vibrant legacy, right? Not just something we read about in public lands brochures. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim to talk for the first section of this panel.
Well, speaking of wanting to do things, Sarah, I remember when I was meeting Charles some of the few times. Well, this guy was so well adjusted, I just wanted to slap him. So what did you say? The mic? There we go. Did you hear that? Yeah. 40 and a very, very, very long time ago, the idea of Charles was born. And you know, I've had the great pleasure of knowing Charles for such a long time, and when we communicate in some odd ways, sometimes there's some words out there that just really aren't even words. And these days, sometimes he texts me or calls me, and what's the first thing he says? Hey, bro. And I remember Charles, Charles and I are both on the board of the Grand Canyon Trust. We've been trustees for many years. And Charles has a unique way of bringing some humility and bringing humbleness to us. And I remember when I first joined the board many, many years ago, and feeling pretty good about myself. And Charles said, well, it was 6-4, 5 against, and 10 abstained. Thanks, Charles. Thanks for that. You son of a bitch, I thought. Well, and so another time, we were out there at the Cane Ranch, out on the plateau, looking out over this incredible landscape. And we had some folding chairs sitting next to each other, watching the sunset. We had a glass of wine. And I asked him, so, Charles, you ever go by any other names? And he kind of thought, no, not really, no, usually always Charles. I said, okay, I'll call you Chuck. And he said, oh, I don't know. I said, no, Chuck. Chuck, it is. So we've been going back and forth with all sorts of banter, crazy things, but really, respecting each other at the same time, like, bro, Chuck, all this crazy stuff. It's a fun language. As I said, sometimes it's a word. There are words that aren't really words. And I think we all know that Charles has taught us some lessons about listening and communicating. And Charles, as I thought sometimes, we may write to each other, we may talk on the phone, but no matter how sophisticated some system is, no matter how precise, if someone isn't willing to communicate, it doesn't matter. And Charles knows how to communicate, and he brings out that. I think because I spent a lot of time planting. I've been planting since I was in the cradle board. When I was in the cradle board, my family put seeds in my hand and held me over a hole. And I've dropped seeds into a hole since then, and I've been planting things. And I think sometimes, Charles, our relationship has been like the seasons, because we're both aware of seasons. And right now, springtime is coming. And there's this wonderful feeling of soon we can plant. I get that itching feeling, I want to plant. But I think Charles has been holding us also like seeds in the springtime, like all of us are seeds that he's nourished and gave us a place to grow and an opportunity to grow and helped us grow and cared for us and taught us and nourished us as we grew. And in the summertime comes, and Charles looks, he knows that we've passed through the dry, harsh, windy season where our lips crack, might have nosebleeds because it's so damn dry. But Charles has faith, and he prays, and he looks to the horizon sometimes, and he sees those clouds maybe coming, and he's thinking, I hope it rains, I hope it rains. Why, we need that rain. And he knows this, he feels it. And then when fall comes along, and we're maturing, and we're getting stronger, and we're ready to move out and let the world use us, consume us, whatever it needs to be. Charles is there. Charles is there. Say, now take it to the next level. And then winter comes. Winter sometimes can be so difficult. It gets dark, it gets colder. But Charles is there saying, let's hunker down. There's some tough times in our professional lives. There's tough times in our personal lives. But Charles says, hunker down. We'll make it through. We'll get through this. No matter how difficult things are. Charles is there to say, we'll get through. Hunker down. That the sun will come again. Good things will come again. And the light does come. And springtime comes again. And we get that feeling again that Charles has been part of our lives and nurtured us through these cycles and the years. My God, I love this man. A wonderful friend, like a brother. Bro. So Charles, I can remember just so many wonderful things. I remember there was naked times in the sweat lodge. Those times I told you because you're always pulling up your pants. You must have a flat ass. Pull up your pants, Charles. Pull up your damn pants, man. You must be happy in dinner or something. Charles, I adore you. You're wonderful. You've inspired me. I think you've been like a farmer to us. You've grown us, sustained us, and I can't think of anything else than to say that I'm glad to be part of you. That Charles and us, I think we are the way we are because of you in many ways. And that I think we are ourselves because we are the best of who you are. I want to thank you, Charles. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Natasha Hill, and I am from a community called Twin Lakes, New Mexico, just north of Gallup. I am Navajo. I'm no Daidanen Shle, Arab Bashichin, Hashgana Thor Dashache Do, Arab Dashanella. So I am really honored to be here today, and I have had the great pleasure of getting to know Charles over the past years, 5 years, and really intensely over the past year and a half as we've worked on this Bears Ears campaign. So I work with an organization called Grand Canyon Trust, and I started there about 5 years ago, based in Flagstaff, Arizona. And when I had interviewed for the organization, the folks seemed really great, energized, really wanting to do work across the Colorado Plateau and, working with tribes to see how is it that we can begin looking at different different types of economies that we can build that were not extractive industries. And I had done all my work on the plateau after finishing undergrad and was really excited to start with this organization. And I had started the same day I got recruited, the very next day was our board meeting. And I'm like, okay, you know, so I was pretty cavalier about the whole thing, thinking about the next day and meeting the board. I hadn't looked into the board at all before I had started at the organization, which, I don't know, was like in my early 20s, so you just don't do that, you know. So it's like buying a car without looking under the hood, which I've also done before. But so I decided that night that I would look to see, hey, I should check who the board is of the Grand Canyon Trust, right? So I'm going through the pages and I'm seeing all these amazing people, and then I come across Charles's name, and I was just like, oh shit, like, I was like totally nonchalant about the next day, like didn't really think like about what I was going to be presenting for about 10 to 15 minutes, felt very comfortable in what I was going to be talking about. And then I just had this anxiety weigh into me, like when you realize you're not prepared for a test, like you're studying the night before and you realize I am not prepared. And I just felt, I mean, in undergrad I had read Fire on the Plateau and knew of Charles and, you know, worshipped his work and his vision and everything. And I just remember that night, it almost felt like cramming. Like I felt like I was going to talk the next day and Charles was going to see me as a total fraud, even though I'm from the res and lived on the plateau. I mean, I was was so nervous about presenting that next day, seeing his name and, you know, Rebecca Sosi, who runs the Indian Legal Program at ASU. But I mean, I got through the next day and, you know, over the several years have gotten to know him, but it was just really exciting. It was then that I realized just what, you know, a great organization that I've been able to be a part of today. And a lot of our board members are here, including Sarah, who's on our board, and Jim, who's on our board, Sarah Craycroft, John Leshy, John Echohawk, formerly Ethel Branch was on our board as well. But so it's been exciting to work, you know, for an organization that has really set the tone for how, you know, we work with traditional people, my own traditional people, and also our tribal governments. But fast forward about 4 years, and how many of you here are familiar with the Bears Ears campaign? Awesome. I'm sporting my Bears Ears swag today, so what was really, there was a movement happening on the ground with a lot of the Navajo communities in Utah and the Ute communities out in Toyac and White Mesa, and you know the U.S. Or the Utah congressional delegation, Bishop and Chaffetz, are driving forward this PLI and wanted to figure out how the land use was going to be over the next several years, creating this legislation. But the voice of a lot of the Navajos and Utes in that area, and with, you know, the Zuni community, others were left out of that process. And the traditional grassroots organizers were really trying to petition the tribal governments to be able to weigh in on this issue. And so that's when I started doing the work, reaching out to the Zuni leadership and Ute leadership and Navajo. And of course, between our tribes, it's not an easy, you know, it's tense conversations because we just don't all come together and agree on everything. You know, there were other issues at play that made it hard to bring in the top leaders to the table and have a conversation about how this area of 1.9 million acres we could fold in the vision, because there was, you know, some distrust between the tribes. But we had worked through that and finally had all come to the table to see, okay, well, how is it that we want to protect this place? We want to co-manage this place. So there were all these ideas that were floating about that. And so Charles and I had started strategizing and getting a better sense of everything going on the ground within, you know, in Utah, what's happening with the tribes. And in January 2015, just started talking and calling all the time. And it was not until, it was July 16th, and I'm so sorry about this, Anne. I know you guys were in the Northwest at that time and had a big trip, and we had found out that there was going to be this blue ribbon delegation coming out to the top of the Bears Ears, and Charles changed all his plans He was in the Northwest with his family, and I know that that was a big trip that you guys had and had set aside. But it had been, and you know how things work in DC, where they're just like, we're going to do this, we're going to come out, like, get it ready for us. And we had a planning meeting in Toyac, July 16th, and Charles was there. And everyone knew when Charles had entered the room, you know, when he had been talking to people. I mean, it was a game changer. Everyone knew that they had a vision and an idea about this, and their prayer was to be able to protect these lands and co-manage them. But everything changed, you know, like enter Charles Wilkinson. And from there, it was just this momentum and almost like a feeling, you know, triumphant feeling almost, which is maybe a lot to say because we don't know what's going to happen. But there was hope that was built into the hearts of the leaders and having Charles there. And it was just so incredible and amazing. We had that meeting in Toyac that night, and I remember we stayed up until about 10 p.m. going through the maps and going through the boundaries and thinking about all the vulnerabilities and all the questions that might come up from, you know, the feds. And it was just a really intense process. And I remember Charles, we were down in one of the rooms, and it was 10 o'clock at night, and he was like, we need to get the leaders, call them up, call the rooms right now. We need to go over these maps. And I'm just like, Charles, we were there for like 2 days already. And I'm like, there's like no way we can get them in. But it was really intense that night. And the next day, I mean, we went and traveled up to the Bears Ears, everybody, in a caravan of all these people. And Charles got lost. And it was like, we had a bunch of elders and people up there making, you know, piki bread and samuviki and all these things. And it's 26 miles up of dirt road. 19 miles. And we couldn't find Charles. I had Anne Mariah, who was a law student here and a colleague of mine, driving around in Blanding trying to find Charles. And I had placed all these people at these points to like flag him down. And so it was really stressful. And it was funny because everyone was bringing Charles to like these points. And finally, he made his way where all the tribal leaders, we had the Bears Ears buttes in the background, and he was brought in. Everyone was sitting in a circle. We set it up so strategically with the federal delegation and the leaders. And Charles came in, and it was really exciting, and it felt like a moment. And when I think about it, I'm like, maybe Charles hid out on purpose and had this like grand entry into the circle, you know? But he was introduced as, you know, an advisor to the coalition, but also as a leader that, you know, that the tribes had a lot of respect for. And on that day, you know, the tribes made a commitment, and Charles made a commitment that we would deliver a proposal to DC outlining how we envision protection of this place that's so special to us as people and is so integral to who we are. And it was amazing. And then these horses all just came over, these horse riders came over the Bears Ears buttes and were yelling out. And, you know, a long time ago when Navajo riders would come up on something, they would yell out and ask, like, if there was a response back, they knew that who was there was their ally and not their enemy. And there was a response from everyone there, and it was just such a beautiful moment. And it's been, so I mean, that was fun, but a lot of work came after that, just intense meetings in Zuni, in Ute, on Navajo Nation, and Hopi, and Flagstaff, and just going through line by line of this proposal, this 66-page proposal, and a process of bringing, you know, 5 tribes together around that. It's not an easy process, you know, but Charles, with his expertise and his heart and just completely committed to this issue, you know, really brought that document to life and told the story so beautifully and so eloquently. And he's such a poet. And I was just even reading Fire on the Plateau again last night, and I mean, it's just so amazing everything that you've done, Charles, and it really hits me in the heart, and it's been such a privilege to be able to work with you. I know for myself personally and professionally, it's been the highlight of not just my career, but also my life to be able to work with you. And it's really funny, too, because Charles was in the Northwest, and I remember we had this call. I was outside Montezuma Creek. Man, the reception was so bad, and Charles was talking. I mean, we barely had a reception, and we must have spoke for like an hour and a half, and it was about 10 o'clock at night, and I remember I got back to Flag pretty late that night. And I remember when I first got a call from Charles on my phone, I was like, oh my God, I got a call from like Charles Wilkinson, right? And I like saved the voicemail, and I thought it was so cool. And I showed my husband, who's an attorney, who was kind of a little jealous. My best friend's in law school at UNM, so I was like, you guys are like, I get to work with Charles. My life is so much better than yours. I'm sorry. But it was funny because I kept that message. And then I'm like, oh, I got another call from Charles. And they just kept coming, and I'm like, this guy keeps calling me all the time. But yeah, it's been pretty amazing, Charles. And so I just want to, thank you so much. We still have a lot of work to do, in this campaign, and a lot of people's prayers are being carried into this, and I know that you poured your heart into it, and I just thank you, and I thank you, Anne, for sharing your husband with us and your kids too, and really, feel that Charles, we, as Navajo people, we say you wear your coral and your turquoise so that like the holy people can identify you. You get up in the morning and you walk around, you greet the sun, and, and I think about with Charles, all the work you've done on the plateau and all the work you're still doing, and just how, for me, I feel like the holy people have recognized me, but even more so by working with you. And like, it's been just a blessing in that sense. And so I really appreciate you, and you're my hero. And I know that the blessings are going to continue coming to me just being in your presence. And I feel it with all the work that you've done and how you've impacted people's lives. So yeah, from the bottom of my heart. So thank you.
Make sure this is on. Okay. I'm Daniel Cordalis, and one of the things I wondered before we got this panel started whether Charles would put on some appropriate bolo attire for us. I don't see any silver, but I guess we can move beyond that. Thank you so much for having me a part of this celebration. Certainly an honor. I have a loose script, just keep myself organized. There's so much in my head that otherwise I'm not sure where this would go. It's a lot of fun to share this time with you. We had a great time last night, and today just to see all our friends and all these people have meant so much to me, and as you heard earlier, my wife, in our careers and kind of our lives, more importantly. And we have just another great afternoon, great morning in front of us. So I've been very lucky in my life. People have believed in me, supported me, had patience with me in my work in ways that I still kind of struggle to understand. Charles being one of these people, Justice Hobbs here being another one. We'll hear in a second. So Charles and I met in the summer of 2004 when I was a graduate student here in the geography department. I was at the really sensitive inflection point in my life, looking for a different meaning, different purpose, something a little deeper, something a little more than I was doing. I'd crossed a very kind of deep emotional watershed and kind of came out not really sure where I was going to go. In that sense, you could say Charles saved me from the life of hiking and backcountry skiing as a research hydrologist. A job, looking back, sounds pretty good. I think if I had the chance to trade in a blue book for a pair of ski skins right now and a new pair of hiking boots, I might do it. Nevertheless, that 2004 summer, I was in the wake of my grandmother's passing earlier that winter, and she was a lovely woman. She grew up, lived on her whole life on the Navajo reservation, never really learned English, so we had some difficulty communicating. I remember fondly one stretch of time in my adult life when I was there for about 2 months, and my young cousin, who was of school age but wasn't yet in school, stayed behind to help me communicate, and we would herd sheep, and she would give me phrases to test out on my grandmother, and my grandmother would sit there and kind of laugh behind her glasses and continue kneading the tortilla dough. But in that time, after the passing, as we observe, as we do a Navajo custom, I found this personal space to kind of reflect and connect to the beauty of Navajo life, my family, and our people, that I really hadn't been able to do before. Nights sitting in the hogan, listening to our songs and our prayers, and our family sleeping on sheepskins and on the dirt in the hogan. That ceremonial process that many of us here kind of undertake, in different ways, creates that space, and really lets the world that you're missing in, and lets it help guide you and empower you to do what you're supposed to do and what the world needs you to do. And for me, obviously, that was a really transformative time. There in the heart of the Navajo Nation, in the heart of our 4 sacred mountains, and in the heart of the Colorado Plateau, I realized that I needed to protect this place and the people that lived in this place. And that it was too important to leave at that place, and I needed to take this with me. Of course, I didn't know what that meant, right? I was still a graduate student here and still pursuing other things. But that final morning, basically after collapsing in the red sand at sunrise, when the dark blue night and the stars had started to give way, I knew that I was changed, and that something was different. So with that, when I returned to Boulder, after I knew that my life had changed, and I was looking for ways to engage in the Indian community, I went to NARF and I started volunteering. I searched around CU, tried to figure out exactly what's going on. What do we do? How can I figure this out? Getting on the internet at the time must have been Netscape or something. I was trying to figure out who at the university was doing working with tribes. And the law school, and I was luckily enough that we had incredible faculty here at the law school, and Charles and Sarah both responded to a cold email and took time to talk to me about this. And so I remember this summer day, months after the email, Charles, I think, was off doing something for a while, but he did respond, and we talked in his office in the old law school. And we talked about tribes and science and how tribes are actually doing good science, something that I was completely unaware of at the time. And important science, really contributing meaningfully to their own agendas and their own works and protecting their own resources. And he said tribes were getting stronger. And at the time, I really didn't follow politics, the law, governmental work at all. But the idea that tribes were doing this work, they were getting stronger as governments, that struck me deep. He offered, and didn't suggest, but just offered, that I sit in on his Indian law class he was teaching the next fall, and also his natural resources class. And so over the next year I did, and I worked hard to understand what these classes were discussing. It was new concepts, the law, and Indian law, natural resources law, and I remember a lot of sleepless nights trying to struggle with what exactly was going on and what I was trying to learn in these classes. So I still enjoyed, of course, the rigor of science and that opportunity to kind of understand how the natural world worked, but I knew I was missing the human component there, and that was the next move. And sometime in that fall of 2004, the the picture opens up a little more, we end up sharing a flight to Washington, D.C. for the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. I told Charles I was going to have to miss his class because of it. He told me, oh, I'm going there too. So and we happened to be on the same flight, and why don't you get a ride with us? So we did, and so David picked us up in their Saab, and we're headed down the road, and I'm looking at, and so I don't know what happened. Charles really messed up the time. I just knew that his math there was wrong, and we just weren't going to make this flight. And the traffic didn't help either. But I said, the hell with it. If we miss the flight, Charles is still going to be here. Things could be worse. Probably not going to miss that much. David and Charles talked about poker for a while. I wasn't sure I understood what they were talking about. And then we talked about baseball for a little bit. And I think it's rare at important moments in your life that you get to see important people be people. And this is one of those times that you saw him be more than an instructor or professor. So fast forward, roughly 5 years later, I started law school here. I had a stint in Washington, D.C., working with the National Congress of American Indians, kind of filling in that hole, trying to figure out, is this going to work for me? And I thought it did, and came back here to go to law school. And Charles and I reconnected, and I was able to work as a research assistant with him at the time on the Sluts book that Chairman Pigsley had talked about. And there were a few of us research assistants at the time, and just generally, what a great group of research assistants we've had over the years. I mean, just amazing people. Some of our great friends I didn't even know were research assistants, and they happen to be. So I took all Charles's class he offered, including the seminar, and at one point he almost gave me an A until he called me and told me that the curve was too high. So he was going to have to give me a B, and that it was going to be okay. And so I believed him, and and it is okay. And during our relationship over those few years, we worked and wrote a National Forest paper together. Went up to Montana to present that, and really appreciated my views and accepted my views of sacred sites. One of the things I was at the time very passionate and still am, of course, about, and how science and climate change were really these important markers the Forest Service was and was supposed to be looking at, and actually was in some sense, but not to the degree that we hoped they were. So now I work in environmental and public lands law at Earth Justice here in Denver. I feel no less Charles is doing than Indian law. But looking back, the commitment to justice that not only Charles, but our great friends David Getches, Rick Collins, and some of the others in the room, they took that commitment back in the 70s to protect Indian people is more profound to me than any of their contributions to the environmental community. Today, social justice and human rights are lightning rods in the United States. Much more than clean water, I would say grizzly bears and healthy trees. Even though those have their own sets of disagreements, it's very different than when we talk about cultures. And there's a part of me that believes that we, as Indian people, if we didn't have such strong advocates, especially maybe I would even say at the time some non-Indian advocates on our side 40 plus years ago, termination may have been the last federal Indian policy. Sure, but I worry that our country wasn't ready and they weren't prepared to let Indians assert our own interests, no matter how legally sound and how true they were. Luckily, because of many of the things that we've already heard and will continue to hear, termination was not the last Indian policy. And these leaders, including Charles, they weren't the voice. They knew they weren't the voice out front. They knew that the tribal voice was the one out front, and they wanted to support and push that through litigation, legislation. And these same people held out tribes, and they knew that tribes had to be the leaders. And they, as soon as they could, we supported the great people like John Echohawk, Billy Frank, Dick Trudell, Ada Deer, Dee Pigsley. And these were the people that most directly made this movement, this Indian movement, happen. A lot of times, the way I think about it. So my generation of Indian people now is working hard to build off these foundations and build these modern tribal governments, strong nations. And no small part is that possible because of Charles's work and the things that he helped accomplish. Like all of us here, Charles has given me a lot of things. I think we all understand that, and that's why we're here. To name a few, an appreciation of the law and the respect for its power, unbelievable mentorship and patience, an idea that love, just the concept of love, can be used in the law. That's something what lawyers don't necessarily always like to do, is show that there can be emotion there, and it's hard to do that. But that's something that struck me very deeply in class when we talked about that. A vision, he also showed me that there's a vision into a life well and purposely lived. He gave me his time. He gave me a relationship with the Sletz tribe that I would never have had otherwise. An understanding that things I like probably least about the law, site checking, rigorous and endless proofreading, are important and necessary. Lessons that I'm still learning today, and maybe much like my son Seth, sometimes you learn the hard way. And incredibly, he gave us amazing Allen Iverson practice references in the middle of lectures. Constant practice. He also gave me a place for my parents to stay when they come to visit me. And I worry that Charles's email account's been tapped by my dad, and he gets a nonstop string of email forwards. Maybe Anne's seen those as well. He's given me friendship, of course, on many levels, and hope and belief that this fight that us as tribal people and public interest advocates are doing is worth fighting. But I think what has been more important for me is the things that Charles and I have shared across our lives, and things that we believe in every day. We believe in Indian people in and beyond the Colorado Plateau. We both love the Yurok and their salmon, and we want those dams removed. We love our families and we love to share our special people with each other. We love being parents, and some of the best advice I have received from Charles is about being one. We share the Supai, the Coconino, the Kaibab, the Kayenta, the Chinle, the Wingate formations, the geologic formations that have risen and have been eroded to form the Colorado Plateau. Charles knows these formation landscapes are not beautiful simply because they are beautiful, but because they are homelands and that people belong to these formations and vice versa. And taking the long view, Charles knows that that is what makes the plateau special and why we fight for it. Our plateau seminar was not life-changing to me in that I was being exposed to a new place or new ideas or new conflicts, maybe I would say. But it was life-changing in the sense that to be able to care about a place so passionately and so deeply and to have that experience with another person on that level was exceptional. Much like how Amy explained the Blue River, the mouth of the Blue Creek, that's how I feel when we are there in the Colorado Plateau. The story cannot be totally complete, though, without just a small digression about this trip, and a moment that caused me some concern at the time. And some people in our seminar class, I think, felt the same way, and we have a great number of us here, and just what a fabulous trip that was, what a great class we had there. So we stopped at the Shanto chapter house deep in the Navajo Nation, to meet with some folks from the chapter. Then we moved on to the Shanto trading post, just to check it out. It's a neat place. So there at the trading post, Charles finds, it must have been behind some boxes, but a hot dog under a warmer that must have been forgotten at the turn of the century. And probably this last century, but not really sure. He buys it, then he eats it. Just probably in a single breath, it seems like. Even the guys working there were a little bit concerned, wondering what was going on. But what can you say? I mean, Charles knows where the secret spots are all over the plateau. And maybe there's a lesson to be learned there. And it's been an honor to share so many moments with Charles and his wife, Anne, too. Our families have gotten to know each other, and that's been really amazing. And I get to hear about his sons and David and David's wife Samantha and their new child, and we talk about kids and raising kids again. And that level of kind of friendship is unbelievable, and you just don't get that. And I appreciate that more than anything, is to call you a friend, mentor, and someone who's on the other line when I need you, and someone who's willing to reach out to me when you think I need you, and that's unbelievable. So it's been really an honor for me to be able to be here and speak with you about my experiences and why I'm here, and it happened to be because I took that risk, and Charles let me take the risks, and I really appreciate it. I love you. We all love you. My family loves you, and I can't wait to spend the rest of our lives together.
My name is Eric Deschini, and my clans are Mai Desh Gizhny. You all hear me okay? No? I'll just try to speak up, or maybe this thing we can move up. Is that better? Okay, great. I come from Chinle, Arizona, and I serve as an advisor to the president of the Navajo Nation, and the vice president as well. And I've had the unique opportunity and privilege to serve as co-chair of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. And it's in large part why I believe I'm asked to be here. But I know it goes so much more than that in looking at why we're here. I was thrilled and honored to be asked to be able to speak here, really because I know it'd be good to talk about Bears Ears, and we'll get into a little bit of that. And it is the panel for the Colorado Plateau. But before I get into that, I really want to get into my story. Even though this is about Charles, it's my story. And it begins to permeate everything that we do. Very humanistic standpoint. And so if you could oblige me for a moment to hear where I've come from and what I'm doing now and where I'd like to go from a very basic standpoint. I was raised by a single mother, and many of us in the country go through that. And of course, that's not unique to Indian country, but for me, my early childhood, up through junior high, high school, there was one thing that meant the most to me, and that was that I did not have a father. And it was something that, in everything I did, I often used to think, gosh, I wish I had a father. And he was around, he was alive, and periodically we would spend time together. However, when I got into college, I thought to myself, you know what? I want to do it right. So badly want to do it right. And what that was I wanted to find an amazing person, get married, have children, and have my kids never experience what it's like to have separated parents. Because that was what I went through, and it was really hard. And I hated it. I hated specifically when my mom and I would hop in the car and I'd have to go and drive and meet my father and then do the switch. And it gave me so much anxiety, especially as such a young child, and it stressed me out often. And I hated it. It was something that I said, I don't want ever my kids to go through that feeling, that sickness that you get in the deep trenches of your gut And so when I got to ASU, Arizona State University, I found sociology. There was this sociology of marriage and family. And it seemed to offer solutions to these pains that I've been carrying around for a very long time. And so I decided to major in sociology, emphasizing in marriage and family. Went through that, and I came across this one particular professor, and he recently passed. But he taught in religious studies, and he revolutionized the way I thought about life, the way I thought about Indian reality, indigenous perspective, things of that nature, and just in general, how we as humans relate to the natural world, and so on and so forth. So, from that point, that was fantastic for me. And there was one thing that came out of all of that, and that was this notion of how can we begin to engage healing broken families from an indigenous perspective. Not necessarily sociology, not necessarily Western thinking, using Western methodologies. But can we set that aside for a moment and begin to get into maybe an alternative way of going about counseling families, people, so that they can heal? And he certainly had my attention. I graduated and went on to work in the professional field, the political realm. Just read through my bio, you can see where I've been. It's not about that. But skipping from 2003 to July 16, 2015. July 16, 2015 is an interesting one because, one, it's the birth of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, as we know it. It's a union of 5 sovereign governments, formally organized by way of MOA. We are petitioning the United States President to turn 1.9 million acres into a national monument using the Antiquities Act. So we walk into the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council, Ute Mountain Ute Casino, their conference center there, and I grab my coffee, I grab my eggs and my bacon, and I sit down, and I just happen to sit down next to this guy. And, Natasha said everybody in the room knew who he was. I was probably the one person in the room who did not know who Charles was. And I had heard his name before. I sat down, and I had Charles Wilkinson to my left and Peter Sinzaw to my right. And Peter Sinzaw and I are co-workers, although I don't like to call him that. He works in the president's office. He's in a whole other realm in and of itself. But we were there representing the Navajo Nation. And so I started talking with Charles, and come to find out that he is Charles, and he's the author to the book that Chairwoman Pigsley spoke of, about the Siletz people. And I thought, wow, children are Siletz. So you're the one. You're the author of the book, The People Are Dancing Again, sitting on my shelf back in my hogan in Chinle, Arizona. And I thought, that is just so neat. I can finally tell my kids, I met Charles Wilkinson, the author of this book. And I have 3 children. Their names are Sequoia, Denali, and Nakoa. So I thought, okay, neat enough. A little serendipitous, but let's proceed. So, prior to this discussion, we showed up, and the Hopi vice chairman and I, we thought, why don't we just formalize this coalition of peoples, community building, and turn it into what it is now, the Intertribal Coalition. And we would ask the tribal leaders if they wouldn't mind, the Hopi vice chairman, Alfred Lomakwahu, if he and I could serve as the co-chairs to get things started. And so we did that. They agreed, and it was interesting. I jumped right at it and started to facilitate the discussion. I asked the question, why are we doing what we're doing? Because the answer to that was going to drive everything we did. It was going to answer every question that comes our way. And it was going to pierce through the fray, be it through the congressional delegation in Utah who, adamantly continues to oppose what we're doing, but it would also inspire the people to do things that they probably wouldn't otherwise do. And the answer to that, and there was about 40 or 50 folks in the room, tribal leaders, traditional practitioners, medicine people, support staff, is a mix. And we filled up one of those white sheets that you stick on the wall, you write on the markers, and by and large, everything that we put on there spoke to healing. And it spoke to ceremony. It spoke to the need to have the access to gather medicinal herbs, practice ceremony the way we've been practicing ceremony since time immemorial. Each tribe, we have our own way. We have our own language. And which was fantastic. We had our answer. But there was one thing that was missing, was that what was the vehicle that was going to transport our indigenous truth? Knowing Charles was in the room, I remember facilitating, and I remember thinking, come on, Charles, speak up. He hadn't said a word. And again, I asked, how are we going to move this forward? And again, he didn't say anything. It wasn't until finally he did. And it was the framework that we needed. He finally spoke up. And as a facilitator, you have to have the kinds of contribution. You have to be able to extract the strength in the room, pull people's gifts, and transform them into a cohesive, strategic plan. And finally, he spoke up. And he said, we are going to sit down with these federal officials tomorrow on the landscape of the Bears Ears. We are going to tell them that we're going to deliver a formal proposal to the president to protect and conserve these lands consistent with what people's voice. And we're going to do it by October 15th. And that's precisely what we did the very next day. And I was in utter awe of not only the contribution that he offered that day, but the performance of everybody that following day. Now, I want to reiterate, the tribes have stated, the tribal leaders, the tribal people have stated, the Bears Ears into Tribal Coalition effort is about healing. It's about our ability to heal. It's about our ability to practice ceremony. First and foremost, before conservation, before our environmental purposes, it was something so unique that we could offer. And again, it can all be surmised by healing. One of the things that, coming here, I was starting to think, how could I speak to Charles and how much he means to me in such a way that I think everyone in the Bears Ears into Tribal Coalition would agree. And it really boils down to, I often think that I'm not an expert of anything, but I am an expert of myself. And I know how to feel, and I know how to think to a certain degree. And it always boils down to is who I am. I am a father of 3 beautiful children. And as many of you are in this room, your parents as well. And we go and do the things that we do. And sometimes our kids watch us. They might see us deliver food to the poor. Or they might see us, maybe in our younger days, stand on the streets with a picket sign, marching for a certain cause. And our kids ask us, why did you do that? Why this? Why that? In their ever inquisitive, developing minds. And of course, many of us, articulate as we are, can come up with an elaborate and extensive story, about why we do what we do. But I think at the end of it all, we often stop and say, well, it's because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. But of course, when we're talking to our kids, that's a tough one because you start to dive into the virtues and principles of life, one in which you can't escape from your own kids because they're going to hold you accountable thereafter. But isn't that what life is all about? Is capturing the future of those we love the most. So I say that because, it always boils down to why do we do the things that we do? And, we really think, what can I give to my kids? What gifts can I provide that goes far beyond, the periodic trips to Disneyland, a decent upbringing, safety, food on the table? What can I give to my kids? And for me, I want to give them that it factor, the X factor, the wisdom that they could use and hold to get through the challenges of life, to endure, to persevere, to achieve. And as many of us know, I'm sure all of us know, the world is full of incredible, unfair circumstances, cruel, harsh realities. What is it that I can give my children so that they can achieve during those times when I'm not there to be with them? Charles is a rare kind of person who comes along with that unique ability to drop a rock in water and have an immediate impact. He has an immediate sense that we all tend to feel, and many of us that have spoken, many of us who have worked with him know this. And that is, the sense of hope, the sense of possibilities, the vision. It's immediate. But what is often not so immediate is the ripple effects. Charles doesn't know this, but he has had an incredible, profound impact on my life because he has provided a future for my children. My children are enrolled with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. But what does that mean, really? What it really means is that, my kids being of the Pacific Northwest, and my kids being raised on the Navajo reservation, it means they know who they are. It means that they too will always have a place to call home. Back when the tribe was terminated in Oregon and then restored because of the work of Charles, when I ask myself, what kind of father do I want to be? I think to myself, one who knows how to do the right thing. One who knows what that looks like. One who has done it over and over and over again. The ripple effects of that water dropped in, or that rock dropped in the body of water is Charles. And I just can't tell you how thankful I am from the deepest part of who I am. This notion of being the kind of father that I want, unfortunately I divorced and, And my children go through the kinds of things that, in part that I did not want them to go through. They go with their mother, and then they go with me. But the question becomes is, they don't have to experience what I experienced. And I think that, we all have our own sense of healing. We all have our own experiences. And so, Charles being so many things, an attorney, a professor, a human advocate, a friend, he's also a healer. Not from a traditional medicine man's perspective, but he's a healer. And that's what the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition's work is all about. He can bring a smile to our face. He can show us possibilities. He demonstrates hope. And he's proven it many times over and again. And to me, he's a father. I'm sure my healing is going to be a lifelong process. But, when my kids are much older, they'll be able to go to sleds. And they'll be able to go to the Bears Ears. They'll be able to fish. And they'll be able to heal because of this man. I can't believe that. So, saying thank you from the deepest part of it isn't enough. And so, for that, I have a gift for Charles. And it's a bear. And it has a fish inside. And it's a turquoise fish. And I saw this and I immediately thought, Charles, it's such a little tiny thing, and but it means everything that I've stated here. And my kids have never met you. We need to change that. But I'm very much looking forward to getting this Bears Ears work done, and for not just tribal people, but for everyone. I think we can all appreciate the things that he stands for and how he's impacted our lives. And the Chairwoman Dolores Pigsley, I believe Bud Lane, Miranda Williams is a fantastic woman, the mother of my children. She continues to heal our people on the Navajo Reservation in the Chinle area. Dietetics is her passion, and I think she very much agree with the things I had to say about Charles, and the opportunities that we have for our children is because of this wonderful man. He brings so many people to the room, and we can accomplish things that nobody is saying that we can. Right now they're saying we can't deliver on the Antiquities Act, but damn it, we're going to get it done, aren't we? So thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you to all of you for that very moving panel, all of your contributions. And I'm afraid we don't have time at this point for questions, but you can bring your Colorado Plateau questions and thoughts to later panels too, because we're just expanding in scope, so you'll have that opportunity later. Right now I want to introduce Justice Greg Hobbs. He just recently stepped down from the Colorado Supreme Court. He is a poet, a writer, an expert in water law, an esteemed practitioner, and just a really fun and wonderful person. So thank you, Greg.
Great, thanks,
Yeah.
Sarah. And when I called Charles, because I had Daniel Cordalis's application in front of me to be a law clerk, I called Charles, and the B turned into an A. And I see other clerks from CU here, Courtney, Allison, Daniel, and Derek all together. This law school has done a great job, and the faculty has, including Charles. This is short, but I was thinking, you know, who in my mind would conjure up some mythical person that we know, maybe as a Virginian, maybe as Gary Cooper, maybe as Owen Wister, coming out of being a classmate of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, who established the 1908 Grand Canyon National Monument. And I was looking through some old books I had on my bookshelf, and I came across Ellsworth Kolb, photographer of the Grand Canyon, he and his brother, Through the Grand Canyon from Wyoming to Mexico is the book. And so there are a lot of readings I could do, but this is Owen Wister's foreword to Kolb's book. And he's speaking, I think, not only of the Grand Canyon, but of all these sacred stories and originations and the people of the earth and all of us who love this great Colorado Plateau. We heard such moving testimony about why the Bears' Ears should be the next national monument. Here's Owen Wister speaking about this country. This place exerts a magnetic spell. The sky is there above it, but not of it. Its being is a part, its climate, its light, its own. The beams of the sun come into it like visitors. Its own winds blow through it, not those of outside where we live. The river streams down its mysterious reaches, hurrying ceaselessly, sometimes a smooth sliding lap, sometimes a falling, broken wilderness of billows and whirlpools. Above stand its walls, rising through space, upon space of silence. They glow, they gloom, they shine. Bend after bend, they reveal themselves endlessly new in endlessly changing veils of color. A swimming in jeweled blue predominates, as of sapphires being melted and spun into skeins of shifting cobweb. Bend after bend, this trance of beauty and awe goes on, terrible as the day of judgment, sublime as the Psalms of David. 5,000 feet below the opens and barrens of Arizona, this canyon seems like an avenue conducting to the secret of the universe. And so may the Bears' Ears join. These tribes, this preservation, our people, all of us, this universe, this secret